So this is a presentation on some hydraulic modeling work that I did to look at Reach 4. I think they call it the Canyon Reach of the Whycus Creek project. There's a series of projects that have been undertaken on Whycus Creek, and this is one of them. And the location of Whycus Creek is shown here in this watershed map. The steeper canyon reaches are pointed out by the arrows. And here's some stats of Whycus Creek. Johan went over this project a little bit, but I'm going to do a really deep dive on hydraulic modeling of habitat delivery. So it's a snowmelt and rain on snow hydrology watershed. It's about a 2,800 foot elevation, relatively steep valley bottom of almost 1%. It is confined, semi-confined between basalt cliffs. It's about 350 feet wide on average. It's 125 acres of valley bottom. The project filled 45,000 cubic yards of just valley material with no sorting. So it's a mixture of pines and gravel. It's ponderosa pine bitterbrush woodland, and the land ownership is Deschutes Land Trust. So you saw these photos in Johan's presentation. This is the upper photo is the pre-project condition. The lower photo is an adjacent phase post-project condition with the Three Sisters in the background is really why I wanted to show this to get you oriented. And this is a photo, and there will be a repeat photo post-project coming up next. And so this valley, like so many valleys, had been subject to a channel straightening project, channelization project, which then underwent some erosion, some incision and bank erosion. And there was a project came in, I think it was an Army Corps of Engineers project, brought in all this really big riprap and lined both banks. And there it sat for the next several decades as dry uplands, a single thread channel with high energy confining a large range of flows, even relatively rare flows, and delivering very little habitat. And this next photo is the same location, post-project, with that large riprap buried under a new gravel bar. So I'm not going to get into how they went about doing this. I think you got the point of that from Kate and Johan's presentations. What I'm going to get into is how we can quantify the habitat differences between the pre-project and the post-project. So this is the pre-project. The red line is showing us a single thread channel, and you can see the semi-confined former floodplain there with the greenish looking grasses up to the basalt edges on both sides. And here is post-project. You can see the network of channels, and you see that they worked around the conifer trees. Those you'll see towards the end of my presentation are now dying because of the high water table, and that wood is recruiting into this system. And here's pre-project, post-project 1 year, post-project 2 year at very much the same location. So these are matched photo point images. So how did I go about it? So there was a LiDAR flown pre-project, as there is in almost, I think all of Oregon now. There's a 3-foot LiDAR database, which is an incredibly rich tool to work with. And that's what Paul and his crew have been using on the Forest Service to do the geomorphic grade line residual terrain mapping work that's guiding their restoration projects. And I used it here to develop a hydraulic model. And there is another flight that was taken post-project. So I have 2 digital terrain models, one representing pre-project, one representing post-project. And I used HEC-RAS 2-dimensional hydraulic modeling software. And here's the range of flows in this table on the right that I modeled. So it's a really wide range of flows from summer base flow of around 18 cubic feet per second, with quite a lot of emphasis in low to moderate flows. And then I model all the way up to the 100-year event just to look at maximum shear stresses, particularly at the downstream end of the project. So let's look at results. So I don't have an image of the lowest flow. This first image here is the 0.9-year recurrence interval flow. And this photo and the next dozen or 14 images are pairs. So it's pre-project on the left and post-project on the right. And these heat maps are velocity maps. So anything in orange to red is 1.5 to 2 feet per second of velocity. And anything blue is less than 1 foot per second velocity down to 0. And I've parsed the data out this way because this is a good way to look at optimal rearing habitat. So at really low flows, we see in the pre-project on the left, some light blue, quite a lot of green, and a little bit of orange in that very narrow ribbon of the stage 3 S channel that was there. And on the right-hand image, we see post-project, we see blue and light green everywhere and an abundance of it. And we'll just step through the next series of flows as if it's kind of a time lapse. So here's a zoom in area to show you, because that left-hand image is just such a narrow little ribbon. I wasn't sure you'd be able to see it after it was displayed over the go-to meeting. So this is the 1-year flow, about 87 cubic feet per second. And on the left, we do see a single side channel start to wet up, but it's very simple and linear feature. But everywhere else, the main channel is starting to get more yellow and orange, so velocities are going up. Whereas on the right-hand side, we're just seeing a real steady delivery of these low velocity blue areas. Here's the 1.1-year event. We're seeing quite a lot of orange now showing up, 1.5 foot per second greater showing up in the pre-project, which is really starting to diminish the rearing habitat. And on the right-hand side, the post-project condition is just staying steady blue. And this trend continues as we go up to higher flows. So here's the 1.65-year event. These are all real common flows so far. Here's the 2.3-year event. Now we're seeing steady red in the pre-project condition of the main channel, although there is a few side channel areas that are in the blue. So those are qualify as optimum rearing habitat, but still it's nothing like compared to the image on the right, which has these massive areas of low velocity and only a few areas of orange velocities. So we step up to a 3-year event, and now it's just about solid red. In fact, it's off the scale in most of those areas on the left image, because I clipped the data at 2 feet per second. So that really dark orange is greater than 2 feet per second now. And the 4-year event and the 6-year event, 14-year event. Now on the right-hand side, we're starting to see some light orange and a couple little spots of dark orange red areas on the right-hand side, but yet massive areas of that light green and blue, which is still that 1 foot per second and less area. But this is a rare flow, a 14-year event, and they're brief. A 25-year event and a 100-year event. So I want to try to explain what the model is looking at here and what data I extracted from it. So I've drawn polygons around these pre and post images from essentially the same location to show at this flow what areas would be that 1 foot per second and less velocity, to try to give you a visual for what the model's picking up when it sums up the area of the suitable habitat. And so you see on the left, the the small polygons with quite a lot of space between them and shooting flow between them. And they're stuck to the banks. They're just basically around the great big riprap particles. And on the right-hand image, the post project, we see really large areas of suitable velocities, even suitable velocity across the whole channel width at that zone, just downstream from a large piece of wood, and small shooting flow areas in between these zones. So I would think juveniles could move back and forth quite easily in the post-project condition compared to the pre-project condition. And another image to explain what the model's picking up and what I'm ultimately quantifying here is these little narrow edges that I've outlined in blue are the suitable habitat in the pre-project condition, although I'm sure it's not continuous like I've drawn here with these simple polygons. Whereas on the right, it's essentially everything that's wet here except for this little ribbon of yellow of high velocity flow down this sinuous, tortuous thalweg. So nearly everywhere is suitable habitat post-project in this image. And a little bit further down valley in this project where flow is working its way through sedges and willows. This is a couple years post-project now, after the vegetation has matured more, and nearly everywhere, in fact, probably everywhere in these areas is suitable rearing habitat. So we can graph this data up, which I really enjoy presenting the data in this way. So what I'm showing here is basically flow height or habitat habitat graphs. So it's habitat related, suitable habitat related to flow. And by having modeled 14 flows or so, I can make a pretty nice curve for these conditions. So this is the before project graph that I'm showing here that has flows from summer base flow all the way up to the 100-year flow. And the blue line is the total wetted acres. You can see it maxes out at about 32 acres for the 100-year event. And the orange line is the suitable rearing habitat, which I've defined as any velocity, any depth and any velocity lower than 1 foot per second. So you see that's a very flat line all the way up to, the whole range of flows never exceed 5 acres of suitable habitat. And then in the post-project condition, running the exact same hydraulic parameters, but on this new topography, we get a very different signal. So the blue line again is the total wetted acres, which goes up to a little over 45 acres at the 100-year event. And the suitable habitat, the low velocity rearing habitat, peaks out during the time of these really frequent flows, peaks out around 22 acres. And then it diminishes over time down to about the same acreage as the pre-project at the 100-year event. And that's because of the valley size limits. So remember, this is a fairly tightly confined floodplain. It's only about 350 feet wide at its maximum width. It's confined between basalt canyon walls. And that's just what this little floodplain can deliver. So if we zoom in on the most important flows, which I'll do in the next couple of slides, and that's like from 500 CFS and less. Those are the flows that occur, every summer and every winter, and are only exceeded by about 2.5-year events and greater. But before we do that, we can write an equation now for how the flow and the habitat relate to each other. And with that equation, then we can integrate any year's hydrograph we want. So this is a daily time series of flow for water year 2015. It has a 10-year event in it. And if we take that equation for habitat delivery by flow, we can then see the daily suitable rearing habitat on the same time scale. So this is a time series of daily suitable rearing habitat. And the orange line is the pre-project. And you see it never even gets close to 5 acres. It hovers around 1 to 2 acres. And for very brief period during that 10-year event, it bumps up to about 3.5 or 4 acres and then drops right back down to 1.5 or 2 acres. Whereas the blue line is nice and steady, hovering at 15 acres and more, with the exception of that 10-year event. Really took a dive, but it didn't get anywhere near the original condition. In fact, it still delivered about 4 times the original habitat during that very brief 10-year event. So in addition to acres, I've put square meters on the right-hand side because I think that's easier for people to potentially extrapolate using fish densities that you might have in your head, extrapolate to population numbers. Let's look at one more year here. This is water year 2016. It did not have a large flow event. This is much more of an average kind of year. And we see very much the same result. So the orange line again is habitat delivery, rearing habitat delivery on a daily time step for the pre-project versus the blue line, which is habitat delivery on a daily time step for the post-project. So it runs around 60,000 square meters and above year-round in this example, as opposed to just a few thousand square meters before that. So another way to look at this data is I've been playing around with these output, trying to present them in different ways to help me understand them, but also to help explain them to people. And if we look at the suitable rearing habitat per unit valley length in the pre-project and post-project conditions, and then zoom in on those flows that are going to occur at, really common events and all the way up to 2.5-year events. That'll be the left-hand side of the graph. And that's zoomed in here in this image. So there's actually 25 times more habitat in this post-project condition per unit valley length than there was in the pre-project condition. This indicates how much of the available flow is interacting with the available landscape to provide habitat. So in a way, you might think of this as a water and landscape efficiency plot. It was very inefficient before and a lot more efficient now. This is the same amount of water, the same amount of land. It's just got water distributed over differently. So there was a 2.5-year event this winter in mid-January, and Matthias Pearl sent these photos over. This is in the project reach, and these we haven't really sat down and tried to match up these water surface elevations to the hydraulic model, but on my first review of them, they look pretty darn close. At least the pattern that's shown of the wetted channel network in this lower image looks very much like the hydraulic model in that zone. So let's think a little bit about spawning habitat in the pre-project versus post-project condition. Paul Powers pointed out this area that I've outlined in the box as being the best spawning habitat in the pre-project condition. And we'll zoom in just a little bit on these boxes to take a better look, because you really can't see what's going on in the pre-project ribbon of water there. And we'll look at the 1.1 year event, which is a real common flow, probably exceeded every year, or at least 9 out of 10 years. And again, these are velocity heat maps. So in the pre-project, it's all orange, tending towards red, which is greater than 1.5 feet per second, approaching 2 feet per second of velocity. And that exact same area now in the post-project is all blue and green. It's 1 foot per second and less. And so you can relate that velocity and the shear stress that's related to it to the mobile particle size. And I've done that here for the 100-year event, which is the highest stress event that I modeled. And so the before project bed shear stress indicates that a 2.5-inch cobble would be mobile on the bed. And after the project, exact same location, it's only a 1.25-inch gravel size that would be mobile on this at this location. And these velocities and shear stresses at this location are actually very similar to the location that I've shown here that was previously thought to be the best spawning habitat in the reach. And what that indicates to me is that, and this is the 1.1 year event that I'm showing here, that indicates to me that there was probably red scour or bed scour that would affect reds that occurred probably every year pre-project. So I think we have to think about red success in these incised channels more than we've talked about so far today. And what I think happens is there's very few and small spawning locations in the stage 3 condition, and those locations are likely subject to annual bed scour, or at least some portion of that is subject to bed scour on an annual basis. Compared to in the stage 0 condition, at the same location, there's numerous areas for spawning, and few of those are subject to bed scour until about the 10 to 15 year flow event. So that's a very different perspective on red success for stage 3 versus stage 0 conditions. So modeling backs up how we think stage 0 supports salmon. The incised channels, stages 2 through 6, minimize habitat for the first 2 life stages, minimize it for eggs in the gravel. So spawning or egg emergence success, and minimize it for rearing habitat delivery as well. Whereas stage 0 maximizes habitat for the first 2 life stages. And just looking at a simple transition survival model from this Bradford paper, if it shows, and these are for unimpaired watershed conditions, it shows that there's, in unimpaired conditions, there's relatively high emergence of alevins at that transition. But I'm thinking that this modeling work shows, and I've thought this for a long time, I think others have too, that the incised channels probably are giving us much lower success at this life stage than the unimpaired conditions would suggest. And then the most crucial in the unimpaired conditions life stage transition rate is this alevin to free swimming par transition. So that's where rearing habitat kicks in. And even in unimpaired conditions, that's as little as 1% success. So if you chop either of these 2 numbers, you end up with a mathematical improbability for a population. There's really nothing we can do for them after that. So there's been some monitoring work done at Whycus Creek by the Upper Deschutes Watershed Council, and I think Paul and Forest Service have been involved in some of this as well. So I'm just borrowing from them with information on this slide. There's 23 times as much secondary channel habitat. There's 5 times as many habitat units. There's 7 times more complex pool habitats. There's more than double the number of riparian and wetland vegetation species. And there's 15 times higher density times at least 10 times greater suitable area. My model's showing 25 times greater suitable area, which would equal a lot more semi juveniles. And a big part of the story here, as Johan showed us for 5 Mile and Bell, is the groundwater recharge, or the hyperregue zone recharge. So this is a plot of groundwater elevation leading up to the project, and the purple line here is when the channel plug was installed, so the project was completed. And you see that within less than a week, the blue line here is the water tables. The blue line charged up and roared up to the surface. Within just a couple of weeks, it was at the surface, and it has stayed there since. So that's really the state change that we're talking about when going from an incised channel to a stage 0 system. And you see these dead conifers here. These were on the former dry terrace that had been disconnected, floodplain that had been disconnected from its channel and from its groundwater. And now that that groundwater has been recharged, these conifers are dying and are probably already recruiting into this system. And that's all I've got on here. There's probably time for questions, and I'm happy to take them.
Brian, you've got a question. Has there been any monitoring on the water temperature effects of this type of project?
Yes, there has, and I want to see if Paul or somebody will come on, because I know you've been involved in that work out there.
Sure, I can touch on that real briefly, but I think Kate can do a better job than myself. And I'll just say very briefly before handing it off to her that so much about these landscapes is not comparable to the pre-project conditions where, you kind of look at the average water temperature above and water temperature below. Here, it's more about heterogeneity, and that's true no matter what metric it is we're looking at, vegetation, particle size, velocities. It's the heterogeneity that is really important. And we do see a tremendous amount of diversity in temperature on these landscapes. I think South Fork that Kate shared with us, last time I remember having the FLIR camera out there, it was about 11 degrees coming in, but we had spots in the project area that were down to 3 degrees. So you just get such a huge flux, which is what I think is the really important part of the story. Kate?
Yeah, unfortunately, we don't have great temperature data on the South Fork. A lot of it's anecdotal, like Paul said, using a FLIR camera and kind of walking around. And the Mackenzie is a spring-fed system, and so temperature isn't limiting for our species. But I would agree that we're definitely increasing the diversity of temperatures, and we are seeing kind of upwellings below kind of gravel islands that are several degrees colder than what's coming out of the dam. A couple projects, or a project to the south of us, still in the Western Cascades of Oregon, they on Stage0 Creek, they did do much better temperature monitoring, and they showed that temperatures did increase immediately following project implementation, as you can imagine, but that following that first winter of kind of settling the project in and the adjustments, that those temperatures kind of went back to normal, but then they also saw an increase in diversity of temperatures as well. So the mean temperature kind of resolved itself after the first winter, but in general, much more, a lot more temperature heterogeneity. And that's all I know.
Thanks, Kate and Paul.
Hey, Brian, this is George. Can I jump in for a sec?
You bet.
So the temperature diversity is really important from a juvenile salmon perspective, not only for utilization of habitat, but for metabolic reasons. So having that variation of warm and cold temperature has been shown to actually allow these fish to better utilize their habitats and food availability. So not only if there's food availability, is there availability to actually metabolize properly and grow properly? And so just some work by Johnny Armstrong and others have shown up in Alaska that having that thermal diversity is really critical to allow them to grow during various times of the year. In Alaska, in the case there, actually having the warm water is really important. So having that variation is really critical to their ability to process kind of the food that might be available.
And the food availability story is coupled to that too, right? So in the more open, sun-drenched areas of low velocity, the second or first and second product order productivity kicks in, and zooplankton and other food sources become abundant where they can't in deep shade, single thread channel, high velocity settings.
Exactly. Exactly.
Kate had posted some construction costs in the chat box that looks like we're looking at a range of 10,000 to 15,000 per acre of valley reconnected with low design costs. There was a question, a follow-up question on that, Kate. Does that include the cost for the trees? And also, could you discuss on where the material is coming from for those costs? I'm assuming that would all be native material and not imported fill.
Yep, you're exactly right. So those costs do include the cost of trees and even the cost of hauling the trees to the site in some cases. We do, however, with the large cut zones and with our systems being heavily forested, we do get a lot of trees from on site. But in all of the projects, we've had to haul in some additional wood from upland units. Yeah, what was the second part to that question?
Oh, if that was also including native material
Sediment.
on site. Yeah.
Yeah, all the sediment in every one of our projects has been found on site. And those costs include the movement of that material.
Any other questions?